Chapter 4. It was a warm day as they walked side by side in the late morning sunshine. "You're quite tall," she said matter-of-factly. Matthew nodded. 6-3. "If you walk a little ahead of me, you'll provide me with some shade." She laughed, and Matthew laughed too. "Happy to be of service." "So, Matthew, I take it you don't accept the possibility of a creator of the universe?" "I wouldn't say that. I would say science requires us to be objective without personally held beliefs or assumptions getting in the way, and I think having belief in God is a pretty big assumption." "You think scientists shouldn't be religious at all, then?" "Scientists should be unbiased, open-minded, and willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads them. Religious beliefs threaten those principles to some extent, though obviously it depends on the scientist. If they can subject their religious views to the higher pursuit of scientific knowledge and overcome their biases, they can still be good scientists." "You do realize how arrogant that sounds, don't you? Everyone is biased in multitudinous ways. It's the human condition. We all have preconceived ideas and convictions that we bring to our work, which is why we rely on the scientific method. Atheists have biases too. It is just as much a belief system as any religion, and comes with its own set of convictions and preconceived ideas. Or do you think science is inherently atheistic?" Matthew shook his head. "I don't call myself an atheist, I call myself a scientist. I accept scientific facts and verifiable truth. But yes, science assumes there is nothing supernatural, only the natural and explainable. God is a supernatural and unexplainable being, which doesn't fit within science. The more knowledge and understanding we gain through science, the less we have to fill the gaps of our knowledge with gods and superstitions. Science is doing away with all such unscientific notions." "Well, please allow me to burst your bubble." She laughed. Matthew was surprised by her confidence. "Let's start with quantum physics, which has turned all us physicists into philosophers, grappling with questions of reality. In quantum physics, we're faced with indeterminate uncertainty in the basic building blocks of creation, and we're faced with absurdities like the act of observing seems to cause a particle to take on a particular measurable property and is otherwise all of its possible properties at once. It raises the question of whether there is an objective reality at all, which is the foundation of all science. If there is no objective truth, there is no science." Matthew shook his head. "Quantum mechanics is a black box that can be used to justify almost any argument." "Well, that's convenient. I would say quantum physics presents one of the best arguments for God." Matthew raised his eyebrows. "Okay, give me your best argument then," he said with a nonchalance he wasn't feeling. He was strangely unnerved by what she might say next. He had never had a conversation like this with someone of her intellect before, and he didn't know what to expect. "I presume you know about the observer effect in quantum mechanics?" she asked. "I know the basics of quantum mechanics, yes." "Well, an oversimplified and not very elegant argument for God, according to a common interpretation of the observer effect, is, for any physical reality to exist, some kind of conscious observer must have been necessary to observe and collapse the quantum state of the universe into this one physical reality. Without an initial observer at the beginning of time, everything would be in a formless quantum state, and there would be no physical reality to give rise to us or any other observers. So reality's existence is evidence that there was a necessary observer at the beginning of time. I personally don't like this argument for various reasons," Rebecca said. "Why's that?" "Well, for one thing, God is not just an observer, he's the creator of ordered reality. I also don't agree with that interpretation of the observer effect. There is a better argument than this." "Okay. The mystery that quantum physics presents us with is the question of how a quantum universe gave rise to our physical reality. When we look at the quantum world of subatomic particles, it's like looking beyond the edge of our physical reality. It's like a non-reality of dimensionless, indeterminate uncertainty, with its own unique physics unlike that of our macro world. She paused for a moment. You understand, I'm simplifying this for you. Matthew nodded. The quantum world is very much an underlying part of our reality. Quantum laws and quantum order allow our physical reality to exist. And yet, there is a non-reality about the quantum world. Subatomic particles have an indeterminate freedom from the physical constraints of our reality, being free to be all possibilities at once, while our physical reality is limited and constrained by physical dimensions that bring about an order that doesn't exist in the quantum world. A particle is in a superposition, a wave of its possible properties, until it interacts with something and takes on some specific measurable attribute, which then makes its conjugate attribute more uncertain. And if we measure again, it takes on another measurable attribute each time. There is nothing to suggest a reason why our physical reality should come forth from a non-certain quantum world, or why our reality should even exist from a quantum perspective. We don't know how our physical reality arose. Where did time and the spatial dimensions come from? Matthew shook his head. We've assumed our physical reality, what we see and touch, is the natural state of matter, but the natural state of the smallest particles of matter are dimensionless, indeterminate non-physical waves of all their possible positions and properties. How does such quantum nature bring about the physical properties of our reality when it's not natural to the quantum world? How does the quantum world give rise to a limiting dimensional order? If we look at physical reality from a quantum perspective, we actually lose our reality. We end up questioning objective reality and everything you'd consider real. And that's exactly what many scientists are doing. When it comes to quantum interpretations and theories of reality, many scientists are accepting notions like reality is an illusion, subjective to each individual, or the commonly held many worlds interpretation where all possible outcomes of a measurement are realized in different realities. When we try to understand reality from a quantum perspective, we lose our objective reality. They rounded a corner as she continued. And that, of course, does away with all evidential science because every measure and result of experimentation is only relevant to an individual observer or to one of an infinite number of realities. It means nothing is objectively real, and science is inapplicable. Yet we don't see that when we look at our reality. We see and experience a logical, ordered universe and a seemingly objective reality where the same facts are true for you as they are for me. Our entire scientific knowledge is based on objective reality. What's the point of being a scientist if experimentation doesn't give the same result for everyone? We may as well be shopkeepers or engineers. But that's where the science has supposedly led us, down a metaphysical hole of abstract theories that can never be observed or falsified. She was becoming more impassioned as she spoke, and Matthew wasn't sure if he dared interrupt her. That's why Einstein said God doesn't play dice with the universe. To Einstein, God was the ordering principle of the universe, and he couldn't accept an indeterminate, disordered, or illogical universe. He didn't like what quantum physics was suggesting about our reality. Matthew interjected, but we have to follow the science where it leads us, even if it leads to absurd or nonsensical things that seem to do away with objective reality. We can't reject the science because we don't like it. That was Einstein's mistake, wasn't it? He came up with an incorrect theory to explain quantum mechanics because he preferred a deterministic universe. And it sounds like your philosophy may be leading you to make the same mistake. Isn't it proving my point that religion and philosophies can get in the way of good science? Not at all. A good scientist continuously questions their own theories and assumptions. I may very well be wrong, but my theories will always change with evidence, just as I'm sure Einstein would have too if he'd been around to see the results of Bell's theorem. He put forward a theory in keeping with his philosophy, and it was falsifiable. There is nothing wrong with that. You would never say Einstein was not a good scientist just because he held certain convictions and underlying philosophical biases. He came up with his theories of relativity with that same underlying philosophy and changed all of science with it. What if Einstein had been right about quantum mechanics as well? What if his way of thinking was the only one that led to a correct understanding? Being wrong and getting things wrong are all part of science. Matthew nodded. I may have overstated that point, he conceded. Yes, and to your point about having to follow the science where it leads us, science is not leading us to these absurd conclusions, we are leaping to them. We're not looking for reasonable interpretations, we're wanting to blow our minds on ideas like multiple realities. Whatever happened to extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan said. A lot of these theories are not falsifiable. They have no evidence or way to observe or test them. You see how everything's turned on its head. Science is no longer the bastion of reason and rationality. It is increasingly dealing in abstract theories and unprovable pseudoscience. What's your alternative then? What's your argument here? Matthew asked. She took a breath. Well, it's obvious when you think about it. If our physical reality didn't arise from the quantum world, then our reality comes from the top down and not from the quantum world up. Reality is the system of order that the quantum world is subjected to, and not the other way around. Our physical reality, dimensional time and space, and the laws and forces and particles and fields and other constants that make up our physical reality, are initial properties of the early universe. Our ordered reality didn't arise from the quantum universe. It subjects the quantum universe to its order, which allowed the creation of physical matter and galaxies and stars and planets and us. A purely quantum universe, ungoverned by reality and its laws, could not have brought forth anything. Reality is fundamental. She slowed and turned into the doorway of a cafe and pushed open the door, causing its bell to jingle. Matthew followed her inside and looked around. The cafe had an old-fashioned feel to it. There were several tables with people already sitting at them, but they found a small table for two by the window. Sitting face to face with her this close and looking directly into her eyes, Matthew was struck by her beauty all over again. He had to avert his eyes from hers and take only fleeting glances as she continued to speak. If you start with a reality that subjects the quantum world to its order, there is no need for multiple realities or other way-out theories to explain reality from a quantum perspective, she continued. Matthew had naturally expected Rebecca to moderate her tone and volume now that they were in an indoor public space, but she continued as before in the same impassioned voice. It isn't the observer that collapses a superposition state, it is reality itself. The smallest particles of matter can remain isolated from reality, or loosely connected to it at the edge of reality, until it is observed or it interacts with reality in some way, through gravity perhaps, or by direct measurement, and its superposition collapses to conform to reality in whichever way that interaction or observation required of it at that moment. It collapses from all its possible properties and conforms to a reality that limits it to a particular property or a certain position in time within our limiting dimensions. That is what I mean by a top-down reality. It is reality dominating the quantum world, forcing the particle to conform to the physical order of this reality in a way that is necessary for it to do so, for however long it needs to. And whatever happens to be entangled with it also conforms to the same reality at that same moment, no matter what the distance, because it is reality that connects the two entangled particles across time and space, because reality is a single continuous entity. It isn't the observer's conscious mind or the act of measuring that collapses the superposition. It is the interaction with reality through that observer, because the observer is part of this physical reality. Matthew had to admit what she was saying made some sense. He took a glance around the cafe. Some people at other tables were turning their heads to look in their direction. "I get what you're saying," Matthew said, keeping his voice low, hoping she would follow his example. "It is interesting, but it sounds more like a theory than evidence for God." "I didn't say this was evidence for God. I said it was one of the best arguments for God," she said as loudly as before. "But you're right. I haven't actually made my argument for God yet. The quantum world is a kind of evidence in itself that an ordered physical reality is not natural to the underlying construct of the universe. Our physical reality seems to be an initial property of the universe that gives our universe its order, its space-time dimensions, the fabric of the universe, gravity, cause and effect. As I said before, if you look at our reality from the quantum world up, you lose all objective reality. Nothing is real. If you look at it from the top down, you have a real objective reality that the quantum world is subjected to. So where does this ordering principle of the universe come from? Where did the fundamental forces and laws and constants come from? It all came from the same place, from whatever created the universe. It is not a product of the universe. It did not arise from the underlying nature of the universe. When we look at the quantum world, we can see what the natural state of the universe would be without an ordering reality. When we look beyond the edge of reality, we gain a glimpse of what the natural order of the universe should be, and it is not something that could give rise to anything, let alone stars and planets and life. Without our physical reality, there is nothing, no space-time, no gravity, no stars. Without the fundamental physical order of the universe, nothing could be physically real. Our fundamental reality is the ordering principle of the universe. Matthew watched her animated expressions as she spoke each perfectly articulated word, her eyes bright with intelligence, her cheeks slightly flushed in her intellectually heightened state. There was a word for someone who was attracted to intelligence, though he couldn't remember it at that moment. But for the first time in his life, he realized such a word would accurately describe himself. Her beauty was too distracting, and he had to look away to concentrate on what she was saying. The quantum world is an evidence in itself. Its indeterminate freedom is evidence that our reality had to come from a higher order, from above and not below. I see our ordered reality as evidence of the mind of God. It tells us there is a logical and intelligent mind behind the creation of the universe that gave deliberate order to his creation, an order that is not natural to the underlying construct of the universe. By giving us this ordering reality, God has given us logic and reason and science and rationality. That the universe gave rise to conscious, reasoning beings capable of intelligent thought and moral judgment points to a God who created this ordered reality. I can't really argue any of this scientifically. It isn't within my field of expertise, Matthew said, though he was sure there had to be something wrong with her argument. Even though he couldn't accept what she was saying, he had to admit he was impressed. She was a magnificent orator, her words resonating with the intensity of deeply held conviction. Your faith really does influence your science, was all Matthew could say. Yes, it does. Much of science has lost the underlying philosophy of an ordered and rational universe, and is becoming increasingly untethered to it as a principle. It is stumbling over quantum mechanics and becoming irrational and ridiculous and anti-science. Theoretical physics is increasingly diverging from the reasonable and rational. We've gone from a mostly theistic era of science to a mostly atheistic era. From the 16th century to the mid-20th century, the majority of scientists believed in God, or at least an ordered universe. From Newton to Einstein, science held to a rational, ordered reality, and that underlying philosophy served science very well. But science has become increasingly atheistic in its underlying philosophy, and underlying philosophy does matter. You yourself have an atheistic philosophy, whether you realize it or not. You say science excludes God because he is supernatural or unexplainable, but that is a philosophy. God is outside the realm of science, but not excluded by it. If God does exist, then obviously science couldn't exclude the evidence for his existence or demand it have another explanation. Science seeks whatever is true. It doesn't exclude anything except what is proven to be false. Atheistic philosophies don't start with a God who established an order to the universe. They start with random chance. They don't naturally hold to an ordering principle unless it is naturally occurring. They don't expect or presume the universe to be ordered. To them, anything goes, including interpretations of reality that throw out objective reality and the foundations of science itself. This is why I think underlying philosophy matters. You don't have to believe in God to believe in an ordered reality, but if you're an atheist, you're not bound to it as a principle. And this is where I think the pseudoscience and all these way-out untestable theories are coming from. If we don't accept an ordered reality as a basic foundational premise, then science is broken and lost. I think that's partly why I wear this cross, in defiance of this atheistic era of science. It's my protest as well as a symbol of my faith. That's interesting, Matthew said. Rebecca was silent for a moment, as if waiting for Matthew to say something more, but he remained silent. I'm sorry, Matthew. Once I get started, I can dominate a conversation, and I know I talk far too much. It is a lot to take in. Matthew gave her a disarming smile to soften his words. I have this bad habit of not letting anyone else get a word in edgeways. I have too much to say. How about you give me your reasons for not believing in a God, and I'll keep quiet and just listen, and we'll try to keep things within your field of expertise. Did you want to order something first? I'll pay. Whatever you want. Oh. Rebecca looked around as if noticing for the first time that they were sitting at the cafe and hadn't ordered anything yet. Yes, thank you. Can you get me a cappuccino and a scone? That's all you're having for lunch. That's all I have time for. She gave him an apologetic smile. Matthew went to the counter to order, and it gave him a moment to reflect on their conversation. He'd gotten far more than he'd bargained for, and it was all a bit overwhelming. Rebecca was obviously an incredible woman, but he couldn't help thinking she was a little too certain of her views and too sure of herself. Where was the critical thinking of a scientist? Or even the normal couching of your words to avoid absolutes? Perhaps she was only speaking casually, as friends. He felt sure she could run rings around any argument he could come up with, though it would definitely help if she was willing to keep things within his field. It was both daunting and thrilling to be having such a conversation with someone of her intellect. He returned to the small table and sat across from her again like opponents in a game of chess, though there was no doubt who the chess master was. He smiled as he looked into her eyes, though he could hardly make himself look directly at her for more than a few seconds. He wondered if she'd noticed how awkward he was around her. He took a calming breath before he spoke. So, that is your best argument for God, that there is an ordered reality that shouldn't naturally exist or arise from the quantum world. That seems like an untested argument to me. It is pointing to something that exists, and saying it can only exist because of God. We could still find natural mechanisms that gave rise to dimensional reality. It is just another God of the gaps argument. Rebecca sighed. Surely we can attribute the fundamental properties and laws and constants to whatever created the universe. Science can't say how the universe began or what there was before it. We can only speculate. It isn't a mere gap in our knowledge, it's the limits of science itself. Yes, unless our physical reality did arise naturally from the quantum universe through natural mechanisms we don't yet understand, which would be a gap in our current knowledge that you're attributing to a creator. Every semi-scientific argument for God is a God of the gaps argument. I disagree. No matter how God created our ordered reality with its fundamental laws and forces and particles and all the other constants, the fact that it even exists is, to me, a very strong argument for a creator. Especially when we can see it is not inherent to the underlying quantum nature. I get it. It's an interesting theory, but it's not something I could take as a basis for a reasonable argument for God. I've seen quantum mechanics used to support all kinds of things, that we're in a simulation, that nothing is real, that we can create our own reality and manifest anything we want with our thoughts. A simulation would also require a creator. Yeah, I guess so. Do you hold to that idea then? No, I don't. But Matthew, quantum physics is saying something about our reality. Yes, I know. It is either saying reality arose from the quantum nature of the universe, which would mean there is no real, objective reality, or it is saying physical reality came from whatever made the universe, which is to say God created it. That's not the only choices. That's a false dichotomy, Matthew said. The barista brought their coffees over to their table and gave Rebecca her scone. She thanked the girl with an overly effusive smile, and the barista grinned back at her in a slightly weirded-out way. The two sipped their coffees, and Matthew enjoyed the momentary respite in the conversation. He realized he was enjoying spending time with her more than the actual conversation. He wished they could chat normally and get to know each other with light conversation instead of this difficult and complex discussion. He sipped his coffee while he tried to think of something else to say. She gave him an expectant look, obviously waiting for him to say something, and he actually felt flustered, which was a first for him. He finished his coffee and wished he'd ordered some food as well. Well, he started, there is an obvious reason why the theistic era of science, as you call it, has come to an end. It coincides with the growing acceptance of evolution. Most scientists see that everything in nature has come about by natural processes over long periods of time. We see the same in cosmology. Everything we see has a natural evolution through natural processes. You're not seeing the forest for the trees, she said with her mouth full of scone. Sorry, she put a hand over her mouth. I won't interrupt. Go on. I guess, for me personally, I look at the sheer vastness of the universe. It is impossible for us to mentally grasp how vast it is. There are around 2 trillion galaxies just in our visible part of the universe, and each has hundreds of billions of stars, and they're millions of light years apart. It's impossible for the human mind to comprehend the scale of it all. To think there's a being that created such vastness and exists somewhere outside all this vastness is just too impossible to imagine. Why would God create such immensity? Why such an unfathomable vastness? The universe is too impossibly large for there to be anything else other than just more of the universe. I believe we're the result of random chance and natural processes. It makes sense to me. There isn't one thing that makes me not believe in a God. It's more that there is nothing out there to convince me otherwise. I see no evidence anywhere. Keep going until I finish my scone, then I'll respond. Well, that's all I've got to say, really. Matthew waited while she finished the last of her scone and took the last sip of her coffee. Shall we go? She abruptly got up, and he had to hurry to follow her out of the cafe.